Going to share mission in a postmodern context. It's a bit of old topic, but still this could be relevant in terms of knowing what it is for many people, and also how do we understand different levels of people today and then engage in a mission accordingly. So I'll share and talk on this topic from one of my PowerPoint, which is on the slide share online. I used to offer a course at Queen's Foundation, Seljuk Center for Mission Studies, on the postmodernity and mission. So this is one of the first sessions, such course. So postmodernism, actually I started with pre-modern because the pre-modern, I use the metaphor of a telescope. The reality is explained in terms of a far off transcendence, which means that it is a community of people who had some kind of reasoning, but reason was not the main factor to explain the reality around them, or even to study people, and even to know the world. And when people understood it, it is always the faith, perspective, worldviews, and also reasoning, all played some roles in it. So very often it is seen as if the world is seen from afar. So even God created this world, and people often have seen this world as created by God. And so the whole perspective of this world is seen from a pre-modern perspective. So then we look at the second one, is modern perspective. Of course, it is a well-known statement. I think, therefore, I am Descartes. The reality is observable, dissectable, and explainable. Everything can be explained through reason. The reality can be objectively studied through a proper representation of samples. And the reason is the basis for everything to explain. And also, if the studies are done very objectively, then it can be generalized to a universe beyond that particular place from which the samples are taken. So the reality can be explained, it can be observable, and also it can be kind of divided into different groups. And so the modernity basically brought the reason as a basis for everything. And some people will go within the modernity schools that they are much more interested in arts and the other systems besides reasoning or rational. We should also understand that the grand narrative of a particular community is possible in this way. The grand narrative, of course, of a particular reality of our particular group of people is possible. In the pre-modern, of course, is the narratives, they can transcend from this world to the other world easily. And people did not bother about different kinds of narratives, even if they are contradictory. And they just held together, accepting, I think, somehow realized that the narrativity is a narrativity. And it doesn't need to be completely, absolutely explaining the situation. I think that's one of the things the pre-modern people would have thought. And even the gospel, the four gospels are kept together, irrespective of the differences and the different types and the way they are told. And the early Christians, of course, they were not, when they put together, they were aware of the differences. They were not simply blindly putting them together, but they were knowing the fact that these four narratives are explaining Jesus or the people who followed him in different ways and with an emphasis on different aspects of the Jesus ministry and of his followers. Whereas the modernity is basically much more the outside reason. We should not be doing or believing in anything outside the reason. There are some schools that highlight that, not all of them. So the tenets of modernity is true knowledge is determined with certainty by reason. There are two levels of knowledge. One is objective, which is scientific. It can be debated, and subjective or spiritual or moral. It needs only a personal conviction or persuasion. World exists in cause and effect relationship. Knowledge is good. Facts are value free. These are modernity tenets. I'm not saying this is what I believe. I'm just highlighting three schools. And progress and scientific discovery will lead to a better world and happiness. This is again starting a belief here that if you are rational, the world should be a better place. And when people are becoming rational, there is progress. Interesting. Humanity basically are good, and reason can solve all their problems. And this is another point which is very important. Individuals are autonomous in society and have rights that society must honor. Individuals are autonomous in society and have rights the society must honor, which is quite interesting from a Graham Johnson's book. So there are three things. One is the knowledge and the reasoning. The second one is reason leads to progress. And the third one is individual should think rationally because they are autonomous. And these tenets are very important before we move to the next one, because the modernity points to the progress, a challenge to the center of our society from the margins. And it's interesting because even the rationality is there, there's a challenge that people think the main streams of the society are around the church or temples or the mosques, but the marginal people thought about reason, and that has become a mainstream. But then the progress via modernity was there as a part of the Italian Renaissance and Enlightenment. Of course, we should accept the fact that modernity has brought a lot of changes, cultural changes, and Renaissance and Enlightenment. It's true. Medicine, science, and many things have changed radically our lives and the way we use the technology, and the technology has changed our lives as well. Even the Enlightenment basically brought changes in the society in the way people believed and practiced their faith. For example, in India, William Carey came as a missionary to Calcutta, Serampore, where he started educating the local language. It was hard for him at that time to bring the young boys and girls together to learn their language and to make sure that the children from different communities or castes sit together, which was a radical change. And through engagement and education and public awareness, he could challenge one of the evil practices in India that is called sati. Sati, we call it, which means the burning of the widows alive after the death of the husband. In the pyre of the husband, they put the wife alive, burn her to death. So in death, they both should be together. But that was challenged by William Carey, influenced many of the Hindu reform thinkers, including Vivekananda and many others. And they persuaded the government to bring a law, a constitutional amendment to ban such practices. So the modernity has brought not only enlightenment, it has also brought renaissance. And that has shaped much of our culture, what is today. Modernity has brought secular, natural, and this worldly. So we need to be approaching modernity carefully here. We should not be anti-modern, because somehow we reap the fruits of the modernity. But critiquing modernity is part of our role, to see the meta-narrative as it is claimed in modernity. Is it really working? And so modernity is a secular, natural, and this worldly. Second one is the power of individual minds is no more submitting anything. Everything questioned, everything. It works on the power of the individual minds, on his reasoning power. And it works on the belief in progress. And then finally, the experimental study of the nature, inventions to control nature and subdue for social use. These are the modernity and progress elements together. So the Dewey modern man is self-assured, in control of his own destiny, knows what he knows and knows with certainty, needs no authority outside of himself, as he is autonomous, a law or authority unto himself, needs no salvation outside of himself, liberated from the past authorities and superstitions, and follow reason, enjoy the fruit of the human progress. It's kind of faith in progress now it's being stated. It's quite interesting. The spirit of modernity is the spirit of progress. Very important. Progress is what the Columbus story is about. It's also sadly the dominant motive in Western society, which led to the working faith of our civilization. The progress ideal functions as an article of faith, the unifying commitment or civic religion of the Western civilization, based on the rationalizing of the world. It tells a story similar to myths. Myths, history begins, the myth says the history begins with Egypt and Greece, not with India, China, or Africa. That's one of the critical remarks. And myth of progress in the Tower of Babel. I like to say that as a critic of the modernity, the grand dream or vision or cultural aspiration symbolized by the Columbus vision. It's important, though, there are some good motives. There are dreams of cities, buildings, and towers to be built according to the modernity, a display of technology, a display of the best architectural rationalization, a display of the human reasoning. And so I come to the point where Genesis 11, 1 to 19, people began to build a city with a tower reaching to the heavens. And the Western dreams of progress is towering civilization, a social and cultural accomplishment of immense and achievement. We have many towers in place, of course. Even today in the Gulf, there are competing towers. And I wish to highlight the Babel towers. At the Tower of Babel, I would like to read Genesis chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men and women, of course, as men moved eastward, they found a plain in China and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used bricks instead of stones and tar from mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse the language so that they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. Floors in Babel. Ground floor of modernity was science. The first floor was enlightenment. And the scientific rationality, age of industrial revolutions, and age of machines. That's what the first floor is all about. The second floor is technology, gives power over the environment. And the third floor is economic growth, market forces, share markets, entrepreneurial spirit, and the profit motive. And the Western culture as the final floor. But the modernity is in trouble. You must understand that I'm not criticizing West as such, only criticizing the modernity and the principles behind the Western culture. When finished, our streets will be platinum, never mind gold, too good to be true. Progress myth is losing its power. The foundation of Babel Tower is founded on human autonomy, independence from the Creator by eating the fruit of the tree. Auto means self, nomos means law, self-determining freedom, using the reason as the power. Idols of modernity. The idea of progress was based on idolatrous faith, on science, technology, and economic growth. Science as authoritative knowledge, technicism as power and control over the creation. Standard of living, economic growth raises the standard of life, route to personal happiness and social harmony. So we had the modernity reaching out with the atom bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, loss of hope and sense of anxiety. In modernity, there's a loss of hope and a sense of anxiety grows. And fear of new world order, economic security, and so the odd ideas that emerge. So there are biblical narratives which highlights these problems already. They become like them, the idols, instability of idols, and like scarecrows. Those who make them will be like them. Psalm 115, verse 8. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. This is what they call about the idols. People replaced themselves, their reason, The people replace God with their reasoning power, and so by themselves. In Jeremiah chapter 10, like a scarecrow in a melon patch, their idols cannot speak, they must be carried, because they cannot walk. Do not fear them. They can do no harm, nor can they do any good. Now, after criticizing the modernity, what comes next? There's a realization that center of the universe, history, and the point towards the development or progress moves is no more the center. And there are many centers. And there's a suspicion that the modern West inflicted violence on others, and non-Western also has made an infliction on themselves in their own places, in their own regions. But they claim of higher moral status, even if they inflicted violence on the minorities or on small groups or of different language or different races. So there's a questioning everything in the mind of human beings. And the ability to solve the world's problem by the Western technology has failed. The strength and the durability of market system and the fluctuations has shown there's nothing predictable. There's no hope at these things. And sadly, sometimes the superiority of the Western intellectual traditions have been questioned. So in all these things, what is reality? What is reality is in a postmodern or in a different interpretative school, reality is a human construct and a social construct. So it's whose reality, from whose perspective? Why someone's perspective of the reality rules? Why someone's construction of reality is given privileged status? And these are some of the questions from the promise of progress through reasoning when it is failing to deliver what it's supposed to deliver. So scientific objectivity is to master the world once for all by enclosing it within an illusory but absolute system, which represents or corresponds to a unitary being beyond history, particularity, and change. Mastering means to legitimate a particular conquest, not only Western, even in India, it's a Brahminical, or even in particular places, particular groups, linguistics, racial, or religious conquest, and a political superiority and masters and possessors of nature. So the postmodernity can be represented, modernity is represented by the microscope, the postmodernity is represented by the kaleidoscope. An ever-changing mosaic of pieces of broken glass that is beautiful when light shines through it. Reality is evolving and understood through brokenness and interrelationship. So the tenets of postmodernity are reacting to all the tenets of modernity, reject the idea of objective truth, suspicious and skeptical of authority, in search of identity apart from knowledge, but through relationship, less morality, only expediency, in search of transcendence to experience otherness. So it's important for us to recognize the fact that the claims of truth, the meta-narratives, and claims of objectivity have often tried to promise myths of progress. Rather, it tended to control others through such claims and dominated through an intellectual persuasion or reasoning, rationalizing. Reasoning sometimes doesn't have even a space for faith. Sometimes it doesn't have a faith. It doesn't have a place for other narratives to be in. So there are much more in relationship and transcendence, and taking others within a bigger circle of reality, brings the postmodernity as the grand narratives. There is no the grand narrative, but there are grand narratives. There are many narratives that exist, and there are many claims of truths. And reason, though it has a power, though it has intrinsic connections, but more than reason or less than reason, relationship also plays an important role in the postmodernity. So the postmodern world is a suspicion of all big stories, progress, because ecological disaster becomes a reality in spite of all the promised land. And at times deconstruction of the meta-narratives. Sometimes meta-narratives become dominant narratives. And so there are subversive narratives as deconstructing narratives. Sometimes the language become too dominant in particular culture by a majority or even by a minority who can substantially convince the majority and dominate them by using a particular meta-narrative. And that the secondary meanings and the meanings that are from the margins are often sidelined. So deconstruction is a process through which people try to deconstruct what is the marginal narratives that can also be meta-narratives that can challenge and deconstruct the narratives that are dominating, challenge them. And it's important for us to humble and empty ourselves, particularly accepting the church's past. Very often the churches also have played a major role in controlling and exercising power and authority over people. And thereby, they have gone into conflicts, they have gone into division, they have gone into war, they have gone into elimination of human lives in the name of finding a pure religion, pure followers. And this is not correct. This is against the basics of the gospel. And so examining ourselves for oppressive tendencies. Sadly, some of the theologies have also promoted the dominant narratives or sided with those narratives that tended to refuse the voice of the voiceless. So it's also important for us to examine ourselves with such tendencies. So the big stories, big narratives, were the construction of those in power built to legitimize and preserve that power. So the ecological destructions and the destruction of ethnic culture, racial and religious intolerance, sex discrimination, and abuse of animals were all part of a counter narratives. They were because of these realities of ecological destruction, the counter narratives began to emerge. People began to question the dominance of the modernity. So modernity, of course, have a purpose of life. They were very clear, and they design everything, our lives. There's a hierarchy, and there's a word orientation, and there's a completed work. Analysis from a distance, creation and synthesis, metaphysics, while the postmodernity is observed view of life, and it's a play instead, a chance, anarchy, silence-oriented, work in progress, work in process, analysis through participating, a reconstruction, and irony. Modernity had the impact of conquest and control, mechanistic, analytical, secular, scientific, knowing God through rational discourse. Postmodern thinks of conservation, organic, ecological, holistic, passionate, spiritual, and scientific, experiencing God. So I like to now highlight a few ways how in this context, it's very important. I need to go back to Bishop Newbegin, who is one of our bishops in the Madurai Diocese of Church of South India, which is a neighbor diocese of my own diocese, Tirunelveli Diocese, where Bishop Neil was there. Bishop Newbegin often questioned the modernity, often challenged, because he thought, and he argued actually very well, that within modernity there's no space for faith. And so he argued a lot against modernity. He sympathized a little bit with postmodernity because he argued that it has at least some place for faith. But then for us to look at this, we see it as a context of reality where people have moved from the pre-modern to the modern, where people have become center of the universe and they're rationalizing power and themselves, where the center who replaced God from the center of the world. In postmodernity, sadly the same thing. In a sense, the grand narrative, if you think that is your grand narrative, you accept it. But then you are not rationally going through, but you can also be persuaded to accept that narrative. So if you are persuaded to accept a particular narrative, it can be your grand narrative. You don't need to reason through it. And that also creates a problem because it is also replacing a particular person in relation to the other and what their persuasion and feeling to something called a narrative is enough. They do not need faith, or they may need faith in what they believe in the narrative. And there too, the human beings are placed at the center in the determination. But having said this as a transferring reality from the meta-narratives of reasoning to the meta-narratives or grand narratives, where relational and other factors become important, where people accept within the group either a subaltern narrative or a counter narrative as a narrative in itself, because they do not trust the rationalizing power of human beings only as a factor that can explain the reality and that can define the way they can relate to the other people, because they also have other elements besides reasoning. So the postmodernity has become more, I will talk about that more in the next sessions. But in this place, I want to speak a bit about how we recognize these different elements of modernity, postmodernity, and sometimes even people call it meta-modernity, where this modernity and postmodernity are combined together to some extent, blended together. And so in this context, how to do a little bit of mission. That is main aim of my presentation. we also emphasize the relational factor, which is very important for us. We do not give much emphasis on conversions through reason power only, or reasoning only, or rationalizing. We cannot explain faith only within reason. But people can always leap beyond reason to experience a special level of spiritual level, which is part of growing and learning, knowing oneself. And once beyond the feeling of the other. And also it's not only feeling, but also experiencing God's mystical presence. So in the sense, it is more not a demonstrable narrative of faith. Rather, it is a conversational faith in relations. So it doesn't mean a conversion, but it's more of a conversation. That's what Brian McLaren would say. So the evangelism is much more of a relational factor. Even as a minister, how do we relate to people? In my ministry, both in UK and both in India and elsewhere, I found it quite interesting. People give importance not merely to our beautiful sermon or a good sermon, but also the way we relate to them, the way we care for them, the way we go and visit them, the way we go and listen to them. So there are many factors of relational factor, relationship and conversation. That is part of our mission in this context of postmodernity. And in this sense, for us, it is important that belonging precedes becoming. It's more welcoming people as they are and encouraging to be part of a community experiencing God in relations. Building relations within the church is as much important as understanding faith or being convinced of our faith. The second factor that I like to highlight is a narrative factor. It's always a story, personal story, the gospel story, personal story, and God's story. You become part of that God story. And it's not that extraordinary things that make your faith story a beautiful story, but in an ordinary, simple life, our experience of God can be shared with others. And that is very important. Gospel can or must be shared in a story form rather than a set of facts, rules, or prepositions and laws. And you see very often people end up trying to prove the creation, trying to prove the resurrection of Jesus. Historically or rationally, they try to convince others. It's an endless job. And it is very often, even without Christians talking to other faith communities, the way they experience God strangely, sometimes listening to God. They have seen sometimes the cross of Jesus themselves, and they come and ask, and it is their story that becomes part of gospel story, even challenging the generational Christians. And also it's a communal factor. It is in the community, transformative community. If Christians are there, no poverty is there. If Christians are there, no discrimination is there. If Christians are there, try to transform. We are not saints. We are not perfect people. But we are trying to renew ourselves. So the belonging precedes becoming, which precedes believing. And the community where we belong, relational and communal factors are main important. And the process factor, it is the process in which they are involved. It's not a one day, suddenly I heard the Billy Graham sermon and I became Christian. No, it's a continuous engagement with follow-up. The relationship gives a time, a process in which others are engaged slowly, exploring what it is like to be a Christian, to experience a Christian life, to experience the gospel, and the Holy Spirit factor. And we have to let the Holy Spirit to do his or her job while we do try our own. Holy Spirit very often works powerfully. And that is mission and the learning factor. So the evangelism, of course, the process factor, it also becomes the process of becoming discipleship. And it's a growth. And so one needs to learn to be a disciple. And it's a missional factor. So we do say the verse from Luke, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it, said, if you, even you had known on this day what would bring you peace. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And the compassion and love, if you don't have, you can't do mission. And that is whether it is postmodern or modern or generation X or generation Y or generation Z. If you don't love them, if you don't have compassion on them, you don't do mission. That is the basis of mission, Christian mission. So the postmodern church would look like, it's more like a personal spirituality. It's not the perfect church that we wanted, but it's where the people are trying to explore. And they are deep, thoughtful Christians. They have a tendency to live out their faith in society. And they desire for a community. There's a less tendency to fight with other Christians over the doctrine. And they live in metaphors like Jesus in my heart. And it's sometimes interesting for a theologian to look at using these metaphors as a real. But that is what it is. People, when they want to experience in this way, we appreciate it, accept it, and encourage it, and journey with them. So the postmodern models of church, there are more testimonies and symbols, parables, and stories to share. I think it's very important for us to understand and engage that. And there are creative artistic expressions one needs to understand. And there are talents and gifts of spirit using them in ministry. And there are sharing of stories through the web of relationship. Avoiding denominational identities using all sorts of media. So the models of churching is non-church like names, cafe church or messy church, and even something else. And in my parish ministry in the rural church, the women's guild, they call it, or afternoon tea group. So home web of cell groups smaller churches. Corporate worship becomes like a theater room, and church is filled with art, meeting non-traditional hours, distrust marketing techniques, and they don't like it. And no leader, but leaders. There are many leaders in the church. And that is the first session on mission. I have taken a bit of time. And also sometimes I have highlighted a few things, a critic and postmodern critic. But if you want to know more, please follow the other presentation on postmodern. And actually I have nearly 10, 15 sessions how we can take this further. God bless.